Hi, you're listening to Doth Protest. We are a podcast on Reformation history and theology. This is Andrew speaking, and joining me today is first dear friend of the show, Stephen Burnett, our original co-host. He's back for
Howdy.
today. And today marks an interesting episode because our guest today is someone who has spent an entire scholarly career, I believe, on the study of Martin Luther and who is also a Roman Catholic. Now, that may sound like an anomaly for some, but there's a whole world out there of Catholic Luther scholarship, people who study the life, thought, and significance of Martin Luther, who also happen to be Roman Catholic. And joining us today is one such person, Dr. Mickey Mattox. So welcome, Dr. Mattox, on the show.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
We're happy you're here. Just to give little listeners some info about Dr. Mattox. He's the Flack Family Foundation Chair and Professor of Theology at Hillsdale College, where he's been since 2022, and he taught at Marquette University, a Catholic Jesuit context, for almost 2 decades, where he was the professor of theology and taught courses on Martin Luther and other topics. He's also, prior to Marquette, he taught at the Ecumenical Research Institute for Ecumenical Research, in Strasbourg, and Concordia University in River Forest, Illinois. And he holds a PhD from Duke University. So some writings from Dr. Mattox include the book Substance of Faith, Luther's Doctrinal Theology for Today, which he co-authored. That's my dog barking downstairs, meaning my wife's just getting home. Co-authored with Mark Mattis and Dennis Bielfeldt. He's also written the book Changing Churches, an Orthodox, Catholic, and Lutheran Theological Conversation, which he co-authored with AGs at Roeber. How do you say the name?
Roeber.
Roeber. I've been in South Louisiana too long, Roeber. And that book was described his journey from Protestantism to Catholicism. I'm sure that might come through in some ways on today's conversation. And then he also wrote Luther at Leipzig as well, which the Leipzig debate might come up to in today's conversation. We'll see. We'll see where today's conversation goes. And Dr. Mattox has also written articles for journals such as Pro Ecclesia and 16th Century Journal. But it's good to have you on. So welcome, Dr. Mattox. And
Thank you.
I guess we'll start off the question. You spent your career in the study of church history and theology, particularly on Luther studies, whether it was when you were a Catholic or before that. What got you just personally interested in Martin Luther?
Oh my. Well, I have a kind of mongrel religious background. So dad was like trying real hard to be an atheist. Grandma wanted us boys to go to church. Church was Southern Baptist. I did that. I got converted. I got baptized, and I backslid for a long time. Then I met a nice girl. Family happened to be Lutheran. I went with them. I thought it was terribly weird. I thought these are really like disabled people because they can't even pray their own words. They have to read them out of a book. And so I found myself over time kind of surprised to start liking it.
Yeah.
And just before we got married, I was confirmed as a Lutheran. And I think in that time, Luther really spoke to me existentially. As a young man struggling with all kinds of things, he was a kind of reassuring voice. And I sort of internalized Luther's theology as a parishioner. Slowly. But then I also had exposure as an undergrad at the University of California in Davis. I took 4 courses from a German historian whose name was Manfred Fleischer. I think he's still living. And Fleischer just blew my socks off. I just had no idea all this stuff was out there. It was like intellectual history really for the first time.
Hmm.
And central to it, Fleischer was a classically trained German intellectual from the east side of Germany back then. And so I was really enticed. It took me about 5 years after college graduation to get up the courage to say, let's go to grad school, hon, and see what happens in a few years. And I was fortunate to have just a wonderful wife who said, okay. And so along the way, got further into Luther. I didn't know that would happen. I thought at first that I might be interested in sort of what happened in the Reformation or what happened in the later Middle Ages or how the modern church came to be and that sort of thing. But my interest finally really began to focus on Luther. And I have to say, I was really lucky. I went to Duke University. I worked with David Steinmetz there. And David was a really fine Luther scholar, but he didn't like his students to work on Luther. And he didn't like students to work on Luther because it's just too darn hard. The secondary literature is just too dense. And Luther himself is just, a volcano.
Hmm.
And so I was pretty surprised after I passed my exams. I went and talked to him about a dissertation topic, and I told him some of the things I was interested in. And he said, well, I think you should go ahead and write on Luther.
Oh,
Why not?
that's the
Uh,
first I had heard Luther describe that as like a, I don't know, exceptionally hard or something. I mean, he
oh,
definitely there's such a corpus as far as
right,
what he's left behind, and they're still translating. But I think that's
right.
interesting how,
Yeah.
um, you know, I guess I'm curious. You said you were before you even did. I guess this is your undergraduate studies with the German scholar. The seeds seem to be already planted. They're already seen. You
Oh, yeah.
said you described it as an existential uh
Sure.
he Luther resonated with you existentially. What kind early on, I guess this was.
Sure.
What kind of thing what were you reading from Luther or about Luther at that phase in your life, I guess?
Oh my gosh, I read Louis Spitz. Spitz was a Stanford historian, whom I later got to know, so it was kind of cool. But Spitz was a historian of the Reformation, and so he gave me an appreciation for the problems of faith, works, grace, free will, etc., around which the early sort of Luther affair clustered. And I myself was a person looking for grace and faith and forgiveness and strength for living the Christian life. And I think too, I had an uncertainty. And so my interest in theology was partly, is it true?
Mhm.
Can I really believe this? Can I live with this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely at least the early Luther, you could say lifelong was that struggle he had.
Mhm. Mhm.
Finding a loving God.
Yeah.
Yeah. So before we get into kind of, I wanted to ask you a little bit about like, the topic of today's episode is like Catholic scholarship of Luther,
Sure. Yeah.
which I find a fascinating. I'll get into that in a second. But if I was debating whether to ask you this in the front end or the back end, but if you had well, this might be hard to narrow down, and I could edit it out if this doesn't
Sure.
lead to anything. But
Okay.
three favorite books you've read about Luther, secondary literature wise, I guess.
Oh, wow. Uh, Favorite. Hmm.
Or
There's,
maybe three that come to mind that were especially significant for you in your, lifelong
mm,
learning and study.
oh my gosh. This is terrible. I got asked a similar question the other night by a woman who's a big supporter of my college, and I wasn't able to give her a very good answer. She wanted to know what was the one book someone should read before they become a Catholic, and I thought, you're going to read one book? I mean, So I honestly, Drew, I struggle with that a bit. I think there are great biographies. One comes to mind, of course, Heiko Oberman,
Hmm.
and I think most people my age and not a few quite a bit younger would identify Oberman's work as the one that really sort of brought Luther to life. And so Oberman was a pioneer in sort of the studies of the medieval Luther.
Hmm.
And as a historian from the Netherlands, He was engaged in conversations with Catholics at the time of the Second Vatican Council. I think he was teaching at Harvard at that time. So Heiko, Luther, A Man Between God and the Devil, is a book that made a lot of difference to me. I think I could also plug Volker Leppin's book, Luther, which I think is still only in German, although some sort of précis was published a few years back. And I think it was Leppin who helped me see that. I would say it this way, sort of ironically. In the early 20th century, Catholics got in a tizzy over Martin Luther because they had authorities on the man who were going in different directions. And so there came to be a kind of argument among Catholic scholars in the early 20th century, something along the lines, who really was this Luther guy? What was that really all about? I would say that something like that did not happen among Protestants until the later 20th century. That is to say that the prevailing narrative, the sort of Luther we all know or think we know, right? That narrative came under stress, under attack, a kind of deconstruction, you know. And I think Leppin was a pioneer in this. One of my favorite moments in Leppin's biography is where Luther is headed home from his studies in Erfurt and reading between the lines of letters between him and his father. Leppin conjectures, plausibly, I think, that Luther's father had proposed marriage for him when he had come home. And that was part of the matrix then of what was in his mind when he rather suddenly decided to become a monk. Yeah.
Interesting. He was running away
so
from
that's two.
marriage.
I didn't give you three, but
No, that's okay.
now?
It serves as a segue too. You
Sure.
mentioned Stephen, do you have any questions at this point? Please jump in
Yeah,
whenever.
no, yeah. I just wanted to, like, to me, the question of who was Luther and what were his motivations is a much more interesting. I feel like, at least at my level, which is very much the general population interested in theology, everybody on any side is trying to use Luther to forcefully advance their point. You know, if you're listening to some low-level Catholic polemics, he was the devil or the Antichrist, and if all you have to do is show he was wrong about this or that or immoral in some way, and you've proven the case. And on the other side, he is like lifted up as as this like beacon and the only brave man or honest man that existed for 1,000 years, that finally broke the back of this terrible thing. And it's just using and utilizing a fable or a kind of creating a larger than life figure. And to me, the interesting thing is getting into his motivation, who he was, and treating him like a person, and not like the figurehead of whatever movement you're trying to propose.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's right. And when you think of a person, I mean, what does it mean to be a person? Well, it means moving constantly. It means a process of continuous historical development and change. It means being a kind of moving target. And so understanding Luther, I would say, it makes a big difference when he wrote something, right? So if you read something from 1512 and then something from 1540 on, say, the same topic, and you think he contradicts himself, well, don't we all? Don't most of us anyway? I mean, even Thomas Aquinas changed his mind about a thing or two. So probably not so bad that that happened to Luther as well. But I think more importantly, for present purposes, like this kind of deconstruction of the classic Protestant kind of settled interpretation of Martin Luther. And I have dear friends who believe this and defend it, and I love them, but I disagree. And I think that Luther is more complicated than those kind of classic narratives would suggest. And for me, then, this means as well that Luther is a figure fundamentally to be found in the later Middle Ages. There's a lovely saying, I want to find Luther in the 16th century and closer to the 15th than to the 17th, right? This is attributed to a German Luther scholar, but I think that impulse seems to me fundamentally right. Luther is a medieval person. He has the exact same training. He has the exact same degrees, I should say, as Thomas Aquinas, right, who was 300 years before him. So Luther has a classical medieval training in theology. He thinks like a medieval. He is a scholastic, but he's also such a fascinating figure insofar as he brings in not only, say, a kind of solid scholasticism, but he's involved in everything else that's going on. He's a man who knows both biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek. He's part of the humanist turn back to the sources. He's involved in that. He's also deeply into German mysticism. So there are different streams of thought at work in Luther himself. And I think it is a testimony to his greatness that he absorbs all of these and then brings himself to expression in ways that sometimes befuddle people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, on perfect setup what I was wanted to get into. You know, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, Dr. Mattox, is because you offer a perspective we don't often get on this podcast. For one, being kind of a Catholic perspectives on Luther, which is a whole thing of value in itself. But also, something that this kind of school of scholarship who takes an interest in Luther and in locating him in the late medieval period. A man who he lived in this certain period of the church's history. He found himself at the convergence, I would say, of a lot of things going on, a lot of strands of medieval Catholic theology, and was both shaped by this milieu and also responded into it of what he saw as real theological concerns and real pastoral concerns within his surroundings. So, can you kind of tell us about you mentioned Heiko Oberman, the Dutch Reformed Protestant scholar, who was, I think, in many ways he pioneered in his own right. When I say that, he got he really invigorated this conversation about Luther in his medieval context. He had a lot of students who went on to be also influential Reformation scholars. But this even starts earlier. There's Protestants and there's also a lot of Roman Catholics. This period of the 1960s till really the end of the 20th century, you have this proliferation of Catholics writing about Luther. Can you kind of share? I mean, feel free to name drop some of them.
Sure.
But name drop some, and then tell us what was that movement kind of broadly about? How is it related, kind of the Vatican II, and I'll ask you more specific questions as seeing where this takes us. But I'm just curious about this 40-year period of these theologians. Who were they? What were they up to?
So thinking about the time around the council, well, the first Catholic who comes to mind for me is Erwin Iserloh. Iserloh was a German professor who wrote a pretty famous book. The theses were not posted. And that was a way of saying, listen, we've got this kind of iconic moment where, Luther, hammer in hand at the church door, nailing up the theses, standing up for individual rights, freedom of conscience against, authoritarianism and so on. Sorry, didn't happen. In fact, not even posted. I would say today, what scholars say about that, it's kind of 50-50, did he or didn't he? Even if he did, there's no doubt it wasn't done as an act of defiance. Even if Luther was a somewhat ambitious young theologian and wanted to work on matters that were significant and was ready to get out there and sort of go for it. So Iserloh was one, and then Iserloh had a number of students. The most famous on the American side is Jared Wicks. And Jared Wicks wrote a book early on called Man Yearning for Grace. If you want to know a little about Wicks, take a look at an article written in the early 2000s, I can't remember exactly when, by Wicks about his own, it's in Pro Ecclesia. It's by Wicks, and it has to do with his own journey with Luther as a Jesuit teaching in Rome about Martin Luther during the 70s and 80s and so on. And Wicks is a wonderful man, retired here, I think, in Michigan. And he's the one who kind of, Wicks's journey, I would say, with Luther epitomized a kind of gradual appropriation. That is to say, like, Wicks never said, hey, I'm not a Catholic anymore. He never, quit the Catholic Church. He never modified. He's still a Jesuit. But Luther became for him a kind of spiritual companion. And that, I think, is about as high a praise as you can get from a Catholic for someone like Luther today. Two scholars in the 70s, 80s, 90s, whose work is really important, Otto Hermann Pesch and Peter Manz. And Pesch, probably a little bit more than Manz, they saw Luther in different ways. So Pesch was a former Dominican who wrote a massive book in which he tried to show that Luther and Thomas Aquinas agreed fundamentally on soteriological issues related to justification. And that book, I think, had a profound impact. I know very highly placed, extraordinary young German scholars who read that and were really convinced by it. I'm talking about the Protestants, right? Mm-hmm. Protestants who were convinced and said, man, if that is so, then I really have to work ecumenically, because there has been a significant misunderstanding. The other guy, Peter Manz, was the director of the Historical Institute in Mainz, Germany, which incubated just dozens of Luther dissertations and books over the years. And Manz was another guy who internalized Luther a bit and really, really liked him. Now, Manz had a somewhat different perspective. Pesch seems to have wanted to put Luther to work in reforming the Catholic Church. And this is a pretty common thing. More progressive Catholic theologians will sometimes take Luther in that way and want to bend him in that direction. Manz, on the other hand, really wanted to see him as a medieval. And it was the medieval Luther that he was really after. And I think Manz thought that Luther had, and this was very common in German, I think it still is, to see Luther as kind of the quintessential German. Just like the guy is just so German, so defines what it means to be German. And in that, what Manz wanted to be able to say is, yes, he overstepped his bounds. Yes, he drew heretical conclusions, but his beginnings were really quite consistent with, or he was expressing thoughts about the church that all Catholics should have been thinking. It's common then among Catholics and among ecumenical Catholics in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to see Luther as a guy who sadly just didn't know Thomas Aquinas. Mm-hmm. Had he known Aquinas, there's a famous or a not so well-known Catholic Luther scholar named Tibor Gallus. And Gallus said, if he had been trained in the theology of Thomas Aquinas, Luther would have become the Augustine of the 16th century. Instead, he became its origin, right?
Interesting. I think of Luther as very much like Augustine, but that's,
yes.
I mean, that's.
Yes, I would differ with Gallus on that, but that was a common way of seeing him. Put some Thomas in there, square him away a little bit, and he would know that there is a better tradition. Oftentimes this goes with that darned nominalism, I'll tell you. So get somebody to really explain to you what nominalism is and how it works, and you'll be money ahead on my account, I think.
Well, that's why we brought you on, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you my opinion about it. Yeah, but I mean that it's extremely complex. Yeah. Because we're talking about late medieval philosophy here. But what I would like to say about it is simply this. There's no simple, straight line from, quote, nominalist theology to the fall of the church with Martin Luther. That's sheer myth.
Mhm.
Sheer myth. Sorry, just didn't happen.
I was gonna, when you're talking about the kind of these narratives, you know, there is that narrative. There's so much going on here when it comes to Catholic Luther scholarship, because you mentioned how there is a certain type of Catholic scholar, a progressive one,
Yeah.
who's attracted to Luther, maybe for obvious reasons, because he did change things and stir the pot, so to speak, and so they can kind of, um, I could see, especially in Vatican II time, um, a certain type of progressive Catholic theologian enlisting Luther, or using Luther in that way.
Mhm.
You wrote in, I think, your article, "The Catholic Luther Then and Now," which was a
Oh,
article you
uh-huh.
wrote for Lutheran Education. I'm blanking on the
Oh, uh-huh.
publication.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, I used to teach there. Love those guys.
yeah.
Yeah.
You said in it that there's that you know that a lot of progressive Catholics do, you said, take encouragement from Pope Francis, who's been quite publicly affirming of Martin Luther
Mhm.
and his legacies.
Sure. Yeah.
And I've seen, and
Yeah.
but you say how, you know, Luther could fit well within the framework of Catholic ressourcement traditionalism, as you call it. So
Oh, yeah.
basically, and we're seeing this a lot now. I mean, you've seen
Yeah.
this kind of polarized Catholic world in special, I
Oh,
mean, mainly in North America, between the trads, as it's called, kind of the
sure.
online uh
Mm, mhm.
slang lingo for a traditionalist.
Yeah, yeah.
And when, you know, those are the types of people like that Stephen was
Yeah,
referring to earlier. They're quick to write off Luther. He is, you know, the
sure.
devil. Um,
Right.
but how can Luther be someone um of value to, maybe not an online internet Catholic trad, but
Sure.
like a true Catholic traditionalist? What is it about? Uh,
Yeah. I would say uh Joseph Ratzinger, before he became Pope, uh made a distinction between Luther the pastor and teacher and Luther the polemicist. And to be sure, Luther is the best polemicist probably of all time.
mhm,
You know, I mean, he's just great at it. Um, Sometimes something you're really good at doesn't mean you should do it all the time. And
mhm,
so maybe Luther sometimes overshouts himself. I think that's just fine to say so. But as a pastor and a theologian, as a teacher of the faith, his catechisms, for example, or as a biblical expositor, this is the area where I think Luther is particularly rich. I had a fun experience as a teacher a few years ago. I was teaching a doctoral seminar on Luther at Marquette, and I
mhm,
had some Catholic students in the group. And toward the end of the course, we came to the Genesis lectures. We read his lectures on Genesis 1 through 3, which is about 250 pages of pretty dense material. And one of the Catholic students came to class one day, he was kind of frowning, and I, called on him or something, hey, what's going on? Or asked him some sort of question. And he said, I just can't figure this out. He said, this guy is like a great church father. This is just amazing. I don't know where I've read something like this before. Why doesn't everybody know this? And I thought, thank you. That's my life mission.
mhm.
That's what
Yeah.
I've been trying to do. And I've spent a lot of time in the Genesis lectures. So I think that a ressourcement, if you will, in Luther studies could be helpful to Catholics as well as Protestants. I'm not going to say the Catholic Church can't get by without a little Martin Luther. I wouldn't say that at all. The church is kind of okay. On the other hand, it is licit from a Catholic perspective, I think, to recognize that the divisions in the church are a wound in the church herself. So
Mhm,
there's some sense in which, from a Catholic perspective, yes, the church has all the fullness of all the gifts that Christ promised the church, except she is wounded. Why? Because there are separated brethren. They are united with us by a real but imperfect communion. So therefore, there is something really, there that needs healing. And so for me, uh, Luther can be a commonplace
mhm,
where Catholics and Lutherans could come together, I would like to see a lot of Catholics reading some of Luther's pastoral or theological, especially exegetical writings, because I think there's a lot there to gain. And in fact, this is what I've been trying to do for a long time. And I think the flip side of that is that progressive Lutherans also want to read Luther in terms of Whig history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that Luther is a guy who shows us that we're supposed to be progressing. I think that that's a too simplistic way of reading the man.
This goes back, I think, just to the trying to use somebody for what you think they're useful for, and not treat the fact that so many people have a hard time learning from those they disagree with, and recognizing the intelligence, the contribution of somebody just because they're not on your side. I think that's a real loss, because there's a lot of good stuff, as you said, a lot of good stuff in Luther that I think we can learn from, and even the things that Catholics disagree with. I mean, these are points that many of our friends and relatives believe and accept, and so to put your head in the sand and to not understand where other people are coming from, especially your loved ones, friends, that kind of thing, just furthers the divide. It doesn't do anything to heal it.
Yeah. I think, Stephen, of a Catholic student who arrived to do PhD studies with us at Marquette a few years ago, and I met him for coffee, and he was sitting there reading a volume of Luther's works. And he was a Catholic student from Hillsdale, so I knew he was a serious Catholic. And I asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I worked on a master's thesis on Luther, and now I've just been reading him for devotions." I think that there's a kind of false binary where you think, like, if I read Luther for devotions, then I'm going to be becoming a Lutheran, right? No. Read some good Orthodox theologians. You don't have to become Orthodox tomorrow. So I do think that this kind of, if there could be a sort of gathering at a kind of center, like a well or a fountain or a spring or something like that, I think Luther, there are some wells, fountains, and springs in Martin Luther, and it's not a bad place for people to come together and seek their commonality. I would say, as a traditional Catholic, not a traddy, but a traditional, I don't know, what do you call it? A Catholic, I don't know what it is. Whatever it is I am, right? I would say that I know that I have a great deal in common with traditional Anglicans or Episcopalians, with traditional Reformed, with traditional Lutherans, even with traditional Baptists and Methodists and so on. So I feel that in our culture today, in the crazy world we live in right now, all of us who hold broadly the Catholic faith need one another. If we don't know that, well, just wait a little while and then you will.
I think there's a where does our hope lie? Which direction is it? Is it in the future that we're supposed to press forward into new territory, or does our hope lie in the past and being anchored to the event of Christ and the teaching of the apostles? And I think that we can disagree about how those things work out, but like you say, we've got more in common with people that are looking towards what has been left to us than people that are trying to see how far we can go.
Right. Yeah, I participated in a book symposium last year on a book by Matthew Barrett, The Reformation as Renewal. He's a Baptist.
Yeah, he's been on this podcast. Yeah.
Oh, has he? Well, yeah. I thought it was terrific.
To talk about that book. Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
about a year ago.
I found things there maybe to disagree with, but in the main, what I thought was, here's a Baptist who wants to claim Catholic, who wants to stake a claim for Baptist Catholicity. I'm like, go, man, go. I think, if we want to have an argument about what it means to be Catholic, then that's good too. But to stay divided, well, it's a luxury we can't afford.
Yeah. Right. And to me, that's, we're having the right fight is important. Right. Like, if we say, hey, this is what the apostles taught, and our interlocutors say, we don't care, well, we're not having the right fight.
Oh yeah.
And so anybody who's trying to fight over what that looks like to be the church that Christ left,
Yeah.
that's people that are worth fighting with, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Agree. Mhm.
you mentioned some of these Catholic scholars, backing up to kind of where you mentioned people like Iserloh, Pesch. I don't know if you mentioned. I wanted to ask you a couple questions about both of
Mhm.
those guys. I
Sure.
don't know if you mentioned Lortz, who goes back farther. Joseph
Uh-huh.
Lortz, wasn't he
Sure.
the Iserloh's, I think, teacher, right?
Die Reformation in Deutschland. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, Lortz had this. I'll start off with this quote. Came
Mhm.
across him. It's from this book called Catholic Scholars Dialogue with Luther.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that came out, quite a while ago. This book,
Yeah.
early '80s.
Good book. That's a good book.
Yeah, Lortz says Luther's no to the papal church is both in content and in intensity such that one could hardly imagine it more radical. But this no needs sober re-examination, for it was directed against a church whose sub-Christian reality would deserve the strongest condemnation. If one
Mhm.
took the sub-Christian elements as the essence of the church, this is precisely what Luther did. His religious and pastoral zeal seemed to leave him no other way. Here we have a special case of the influence of situations on Luther, as we've elaborated above, and this should enter into our analysis. So, what
Yeah.
he's saying here is basically, there are a lot of very unchristian things. I think he sums up the Catholic
Mhm.
argument. A Catholic who can be as sympathetic as they can about Luther.
Right.
I think he kind of summed up their argument there that there are
Mhm.
lots of very regrettable, lamentable,
Mhm.
terrible things going on at that time and in the church, and the church in many cases supporting it, and this very understandably uh disillusioned Luther,
Mhm.
and he was appalled by it, but he mistook those sub-Christian elements as the essence of the church. Now, me as a Protestant, I think there's more to it than that, but
Mhm.
I think that's
Yeah.
is that a good, way to would that be your take on where,
I,
why you can understand Luther but not be on board with him fully? Or
well, there's a bunch of stuff there. Um, so you've got this classic thing from Lortz, like the later medieval church is all messed up. Luther recognizes it. His initial protest is fundamentally Catholic. Only later does he overshout himself into heresy. So I would say maybe something a little bit different. The later medieval church is not that bad.
mm,
It's not that bad. Sorry. Why is it not that bad? Because the church is, we have studies of later medieval German Catholicism or of Catholicism in England on the eve of the Reformation, where we get the sense and we can see pretty clearly that the church is really busy. There's a lot going on. People are loving the church, wanting more from the church. And there are great movements afoot. The humanist movement is bringing people back to the Greek New Testament, back to the Hebrew Bible, and so on. So there are lots of signs that we're in a kind of brisk religious economy and that the difficulties happen there. I think, too, that Lortz's sense that Luther overshouted himself too neatly puts Luther in a kind of nominalist stream of thinking without recognizing that Luther's protest is against the nominalist, but he thinks he also has the older scholastics, the sounder scholastics in Barrett's phrase, right?
mhm,
Also in view. So I think that that way of seeing the Reformation, Oberman would say about this, and he did say about it, right? Lortz does nothing less than slander the later Middle Ages.
mm,
So it's Oberman, remember, who says we have to look at the later Middle Ages not as a period of decline and decay, but as a period of harvest. Hence the book title, The Harvest of Medieval Theology. So I think that Luther is a product of these Middle Ages And even such elements as Luther's focus on the literal sense of the text, shall we say, those also go back to the Middle Ages. And so, yeah, I think the situation is less neatly summed up in sort of classic phrases that one thinks of. Both Protestants and Catholics, it turned out, had a kind of vested interest in a bad later Middle Ages. And it was Heiko who was onto that, maybe first of all.
Yeah.
On
the medieval roots of Luther,
yeah.
Iserloh, who you mentioned earlier, was the first, I believe, from kind of my studies, what I've come across, he was the first to really stress the importance of Luther's roots in medieval mysticism. As something liberal Protestants actually, and what I mean by liberal Protestants, kind of 19th century, German Protestant, whitewashed out by kind of misdefining what mysticism was first off, and then being very dismissing of it. Elaborate on, or I was going to elaborate on how I've kind of grown to really appreciate the medieval mystics. But I don't, well, I think I've grown to find them as very honest from the heart, beautiful writings about yearning for that connection with God, which I can really relate to, especially people like Thomas à Kempis, Julian of Norwich. Even though I know Julian Norwich is obviously English, but it's that there's that common characteristic in their writings. But that's something I think Luther sought very much, hence to why he drew upon some of the mystics. And it's just so interesting that it was a modern Catholic scholar who had to bring that to light, because there is a certain type of confessional Protestantism, if you will, that's very anti-mystic. And I think, and I could see, I think of some modern examples of in popular literature of what's called mysticism, like Richard Rohr and whatnot. I too would take issue with that kind of stuff because it's just so problematic for so many reasons. But but I think some of that older liberal Protestantism wrote off mysticism because they saw it as akin to the type of spiritual individualism and enthusiasm that Luther condemns so much in some of the radical reformers, like anyways, I think Iserloh significantly contributes to our understanding of Luther by dispelling caricatures of mysticism, showing how Luther was indebted to it. But that begs the question: how was Luther a mystic? I guess if do you see him as that in that light, or a discernible influence?
Yeah, I'm convinced.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe, a guy who is seeking like these crazy experiences, out of body ecstasies and that kind of stuff. No, not really so much that. To think about this. Remember these couple of names from church history: Philip Jakob Spener, Johann Arndt. These are great Lutheran mystics in the late 16th, 17th century, right?
Yes.
And a lot of trouble. And who's after them?
They're pietists, right? Or
they're pietists, right?
Okay.
So this religion of the heart thing that they've kind of got cooking. And then if you just jump ahead 100 or 200 years or so, you come to the 20th century historians, Germans who did history of dogma, Dogmengeschichte. And this history of dogma, they would classify theologies that were seen as mystical as not theology properly so called. They would say of this, that's simply a theology of experience, and we want theology that's focused on revelation, right? And so these folks were kind of written out of the book. There's a long tradition of filtering out this kind of mysticism that is part of, I would say, the Lutheran dogmatic tradition. So you have this prominently among German Protestants. what this means then is that there's a kind of effort. Oh, wait, Leppin will make this more complicated for you, but let's just say that in the Second World War, there were mystics, and they were in Berlin, and they were running things. And there was some sense in which, after the war in Germany, to be a mystic was to be a little bit Nazi, right? And so there was some sense in which, for post-war German Lutherans, Luther could not have been a mystic. He had to be like a theologian, and that wouldn't be a mystic.
Yeah.
So I think that it took a lot of courage on the part of some Protestants in particular, and maybe Catholics got there ahead of them, but to sort of crack this thing open and be willing to ask the question, okay, what really was going on with Luther and mysticism? And this is one of the great contributions that Leppin has made in terms of looking at Luther's early reading of Johannes Tauler and the German theology and so on, his work in a sort of small group, right, with Johannes Staupitz and others, to see that Luther is seeking for, I wouldn't say spiritual experience as such, but to know God, to be moved internally, to be seized by God. And I think his language always remains along those lines.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it does too. And I think he takes the best of, because there were certain medieval mystic type, which you said, like seeking the ecstatic experience. And then I think some of Protestant pietism later did start to go in very graceless directions, I guess you could say. But
sure.
I think
Elite
that
spiritual athleticism.
the spiritual, but I think the mystics at their best were always about the grace of God, and I think that's so much of what Luther centered on. And so, just thought I'd ask about that. I had one more question. I know, Stephen, you were gonna ask. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, just I want to follow up on this, because this is interesting to me. I come out of a Pentecostal charismatic background, and so I am gun shy about mysticism and
I get that.
Personal revelation, and people having giving words, and I have a friend that has made major life decisions because they opened their Bible and found a verse, and the Lord, obviously, that kind of thing. And so it's interesting to me that, embracing mysticism within the framework of an authoritative church gives you some comfort, because, okay, everything that pops into my head is subject to the greater church authority. And Luther having that mystical bend to him, I'll try to say this. I don't think I know he did not intend for people to be separated from church authority, having mystical experiences and calling that good, right? That's all we need. Like, he was a sacramental man. But is there a connection there? Is there something in when you break away from authority and yet embrace mysticism? I don't know if that's even a question, but if you have a comment
I don't think so, but it's an interesting question. That is to say, is Luther pregnant with a little bit of what happens later?
Yeah,
you can say that sort of thing. Here I'll say, one of my teachers once said regarding Friedrich Schleiermacher, there's a lot of Calvin in Schleiermacher, but there's no Schleiermacher in Calvin. Now, this is a way of saying that people can do with what you've got whatever they want. That's just, if you publish a book, people can read it and make of it what they want. It's not really up to you. And so I think that you might seize on some aspects of Luther's theology, or Augustine for that matter, who did open the Bible, put his finger down on the page, and decide to convert, right? After reading that text. So there is a kind of locus classicus for the practice, if you will. But I don't think that Luther at all or ever has in mind a kind of mysticism that is untethered from concrete Christian practices and a concrete Christian faith. So liturgy, sacraments, creeds, scripture. And I think in that way, however we want to understand, I think what Luther really wants to say, let me try and put it in like 20th century terms. Luther wants to see the human being as that fallen thing that God may seize and act upon, because he or she has within him or herself, right, an aptitude for God that God and God's grace can activate. And so, yeah, if Luther is maybe looking for experience, it's that experience of being caught up into, God's grace in such a way as to become an instrument of what God is doing in the world. And he does love, by the way, this word instrument, organon from the Greek, right? So Paul became the instrument of God, right? So I think experience can be well within the framework of community, faith, church, practice, etc., without kind of going off the rails into something else. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that'd be something when we have for our listeners in our pre-show convo, we mentioned Volker Leppin is coming on the show. We're very thankful for, and I know he'll speak a lot to kind of the this scriptural principle that Luther held, which in many ways prevented Luther from going the route of that type of individualism. I think that we're kind of referring to. Yeah. But anyways, I was going to ask you, Dr. Mattox, before we go, kind of the big, I guess it's the big question. Well, I don't know if it's the $1 million question, if you say, but you meant one of the other Catholic scholars you mentioned, Otto Pesch. You talk about how you mentioned earlier how Pesch argued that Luther and Thomas Aquinas had a broad agreement on soteriology as it related to justification, and that's seeing as this is so much the crux when it comes down to like the difference between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. In regard to like essential doctrine, for a scholar to assert that actually there's a broad agreement between Luther and then Thomas Aquinas, implies that the difference between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism is ultimately superficial. And it seems like a rather ambitious thing to undertake that argument. But can you, what's your personal thoughts about that argument? And are those, and if it's a good argument, what are the implications of it, I guess?
So I would say that identifying a kind of grund, a sort of foundational level at which there is a deep agreement, is not inconsistent with recognizing quite different elaborations, and that these different elaborations can, butt into each other in sort of difficult ways. The classic agreement on this between Lutherans and Catholics is the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. And what they said there is that we have an agreement in fundamental truths, but the two sides elaborate it differently. And these differences are real and important, but they are not in and of themselves church dividing. If these were the only issues we disagreed about, then we should be in one church. Now, the question that naturally follows from that is, okay, so why aren't we? Of course, there are a lot of sociological reasons for that, but the theological ones tend to gather around Mary and the Pope. Straight up Marian dogmas and papal infallibility. And I think this is quite interesting to me. I think Catholics and Lutherans recognize for a couple of hundred years or longer. I think theologians knew and explicitly would say, these are the issues that more divide us, really, because we can find a lot of common ground in regard to justification. So, yeah, I would say Protestant friends of mine who want to hang on to the big difference argument will hang their hats on imputation.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. I think that's a good point. And needs some more discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it needs more discussion on I'm an imputation guy, but I also recognize that imputation and infusion, those words are not there in Bible times or early church. I mean, these are later debates.
Right.
And so, I recognize that. But
Yeah.
well, Dr. Mattox, thank you for coming on the show. This is really, I mean, I was thinking about bringing you on for a while, and when I was able to get your contact and reached out, and your willingness to come on, it's made for a great episode. And Stephen, thanks for joining us too. So yeah, blessings on your continued work. It sounds like you kind of early on in your career at Hillsdale. I mean, you started
Oh,
just
I'm having a
years ago.
blast.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm having a blast. We got a lot of kids here who want to learn theology.
That's good.
And that's so unusual in today's educational economy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is a place where you can teach theology and the students come to your office
Wow.
without being asked. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great fun. It's a great place. I love Hillsdale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
good. Well, blessings to you, and
Thank you.
thank you for being on the show.
Good to meet both of you. Y'all have a nice day now.
Thank you.